Welcome to this YSL Reporting Services tutorial. This video explains how to create dynamic groups and filters using parameters in a report. The video really comes from a question asked on a recent training course, so I'm going to start by showing you the example we'll create together. Then we'll look at how to create a basic grouped table, followed by how to use a parameter to control the grouping of that table. We'll then move on and look at how you can use Dynamic SQL to populate datasets, again using the values taken from a parameter, and then how you can apply those filters dynamically to either a table in a report or a dataset or any other object in the report which supports filters. So it's quite an interesting video, quite a few interesting techniques used here. Let's get started. The subject for this video comes from a question I was asked recently on a training course involving SQL Server and reporting services. The delegate wanted to be able to create a report with both dynamic grouping and dynamic filtering controlled by parameters. So in this example, what we've got the ability to do is choose how our table and chart is grouped from a drop-down list parameter. And based on the value selected in the group by parameter, I can then choose a list of filters. So currently I can select a particular range of film certificates. And when I choose to view the report, it filters both the table and the chart to display the relevant results eventually. There we go. But I can also choose to alter the way the report is grouped. So if I choose, for example, the genre group, I then get a list of different options for the filter selection. So I can select action, adventure, awful, and crime, for example, and view the report, and then the table and the chart are rendered appropriately. Now, for an end user, this is a fairly simple and intuitive report to work with, which is exactly how it should be for an end user. As the developer responsible for building the report, however, things aren't quite so simple. There are a few things that are easy to get wrong about building a report like this, so I thought it was worthwhile creating this video to talk you through a few of the interesting tips and tricks involved in making this whole system work. If you'd like to follow along with this video, there are a few things you'll need to do to get started, and we've created this basic playlist to help you install the software you'll need. The first video explains how to install an instance of SQL Server, as well as how to create the YSL Movies database, and you'll find a link in that video's description which you can use to download a script which will create the database fairly quickly. The second video explains how to install a report server for SQL Server, and that will be required if you want to deploy your report project at the end. And finally, the third video explains how to install the business intelligence templates for Visual Studio. You'll need those in order to create the report server project in the first place. That video explains how to use Visual Studio 2019, but in this video I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2017 instead. The version you use doesn't really matter too much. So if you've followed all those steps already, you should be at the stage where you have a copy of the YSL Movies database installed on an instance of SQL Server. Mine's called SQL 2017. You should also have access to the business intelligence templates in Visual Studio, so I've just opened up Visual Studio 2017, and I can choose to create a new report server project from here, either by clicking the new project link on the start page, or by heading to the File menu and choosing New Project. When the dialog box appears, I can select the Reporting Services category from the left-hand side, followed by Report Server Project on the right. I can give my report server project a new name if I like. I'm going to leave mine called Report Project 1, and then I can also change the directory that the project will be stored in. I'll leave that as the default. So all I need to do then is click OK to create a brand new blank report server project. Next, I can choose to add a new report to this project by right-clicking on the Reports folder in the Solution Explorer window, followed by choosing Add and then New Item. I can select Report from the list, and then if I'd like to give my report a new name, I can change it down here. I'll leave mine as Report 1, and then I can click the Add button to create my new report. Next, I can choose to create a data source which connects to the Movies database. So to do that, I can right-click on the Data Sources folder in the Report Data window, and then choose Add Data Source. I can give the data source a better name than Data Source 1, I'll call this one Movies. I can choose what type of server to connect to, so it's not an Analysis Services server, I want a Microsoft SQL server. I can then either type in a connection string, or more conveniently, click the Build button to help me construct the connection string. I can either select the server name from the drop-down list, or if I know its name, I can type it in directly. So I'm going to type in a full stop, followed by a backslash, followed by SQL 2017. I'll use Windows Authentication to connect to this server, as that's how I configured that instance of SQL Server when I installed it. If you chose different options when you installed SQL Server, you may need different options selected here as well. I can then just select my database name from the drop-down list. I can choose Movies. I can choose to test that my connection is going to work, just to reassure myself that it works. It did indeed. I can click OK a couple of times. OK, OK, and OK. Now, one thing to be slightly careful of, you may find a little bug trips you up here. If I double click back on my movies data source, although I selected to use Windows Authentication, if I head back to the credentials page, the dialog box has forgotten that already. It's set it back to do not use credentials, which won't allow me to connect to my movies database. So I'm going to make sure I've selected use Windows Authentication and then hit OK, and then just double click on that data source one more time and make sure that that has been remembered this time, which it has. So there's our data source created. Now I can create a data set which will be used to populate both the table and the chart in the body of the report. Just to have a quick look at what we'll need to include in that data set, if I switch back to the deployed version I showed you earlier, we'll need a data set which includes a field we can count to show the count of films. We'll want the runtime in minutes so that we can take the average of that, and the Oscar win so we can find the sum of that. I'll also need to be able to display the name of which field I've chosen to group by, so I'll need to include the genre column, as well as the certificate, country, director, and studio as well. So to make that work, if I switch back to Visual Studio, my report project, I can right-click on my movies data source and choose to add a data set which uses it. I'll change the name of my data set so that it's called something like Film Details. And then rather than writing out my query from scratch, I can click the Query Designer button to help me build it. I'll add in several tables to start with. If I click the Add Table button on the top toolbar up here, I can choose to include my film table. I'll include that first as that's the main one. If I double click that, it will be inserted. I can then double click on the certificate table and the country table. I'm going to omit the director table just for the moment. I'll come back and include that a little later and explain why I'm doing it later when we get back to it. So for now, I'm going to skip over that one to the genre table, followed by the studio table as well. I can then close down the Add Table window and then select the fields that I would like to include. I'll include the film ID so that I can count that, and then I'll also scroll down a little and I'll include the runtime minutes so that I can take the average, as well as the Oscar win so that I can find the sum. Then from each of the other four tables, I simply want to include the column containing the description of that value, so certificate, followed by country, genre, and studio. At that point, I'm going to click OK a couple of times, and there's my dataset created with all the fields available to populate my visuals in the report. Next, I'll create a basic table to display some of the results from that dataset. To begin with, I'll set it up so that the table is grouped by genre, so it won't be sort of dynamic to begin with. I just want to create the basic outline of that table. So I'll group it by genre by default, and then have the count of films, average runtime, and total Oscars. So to make that work, we can right-click somewhere in the body of the report and choose Insert Table. I'll just drag that up to the top left-hand corner, and I'll start by including just the genre field from the dataset. Having done that, if I quickly preview this report at this stage, what I'll end up with is one row for each individual genre in the dataset. Or I would if I hadn't encountered the second bug of the day, whereby sometimes the default font isn't displayed properly in a table. You can clearly see there are many rows of data there, but none of the text is being displayed. If I switch back to the design view, there are a couple of suggestions for how to stop that from happening. One simple way is to select the cell or cells containing the text, and then you can either change the font size or some property of the font. If I switch to, let's say, I don't know, Arial Narrow, and then immediately switch it back to Arial again, having done that, if I preview the report again, I'll suddenly see all the results. Reporting Services is full of wonderful little bugs like this. Anyway, the issue I'm having at the moment is that each row in the table represents one single film from my dataset, and I want to group my films by which genre they belong to, so all the adventure films in one group, all the action films in another, etc. One simple way to solve that, if I switch back to the design view, I can right-click on the Details item in the Grouping panel at the bottom of the screen, and then choose to view the group properties of that. On the first page of the dialog box, I can choose to add a group expression by clicking the Add button, and then I can simply select a field that I want to group on. So I'm going to group on the genre field. I'm also going to change the name of the group here, so details doesn't really make sense anymore. I think this is a row group, so I'm going to call my group row group. Having done that, if I click OK, when I preview the report again, you might be able to spot, actually, you might have noticed the little symbol next to the genre in the table changes from 3 horizontal bars to a sort of parenthesis or bracket style symbol. If I switch to a preview again, I can now see that I've only got one row for each genre in the result set. From that point, it's fairly easy to add in the aggregates. If I were to select, let's see, the film ID for the next column, it attempts to give me a sum of film ID because it recognises that film ID is a number. I don't want that to be a sum, I want it to be a count. So I can select the word sum by clicking on it, followed by right-clicking on the word sum. Then I can choose Summarise By, and then choose one of my other aggregate functions. Let's go for count. The next column, I want to see an average runtime minutes, so I can select the runtime minutes field. Again, I get a sum by default. I can click on the word sum, and then right click, and then choose Summarise By AVG instead. I'll need one more column, so let's right click and choose to insert a new column to the right. I can then select the Oscar wins field from there, and this time I do want the sum of Oscar wins. Let's see if we encounter the same little text bug again if I preview the report again. This time I'm seeing the actual results. I don't need to bother changing the font details. Could do with a little bit of formatting, so let's just tidy up the runtime minutes to display 2 decimal places, and maybe alter the column headings here as well and change a couple of column widths. If I switch back to the design view, I can right click on the text box containing the average runtime and then choose text box properties. On the dialog box it appears, I can head to the number page, and then I can choose the number option and then set that to 2 decimal places. I can then click OK. If I want to change the titles at the top of each column of the table, I can simply select the text in there and overtype that. So I'll go for count of films for the first column, and then the second column will be, I'll call this one average runtime, or AVG runtime for short, and then just get rid of the word minutes from the end just to tidy up the title. And then the Oscar wins, I can call that one total Oscars. And again, I'll just get rid of the word wins from there. So total Oscars. A quick little bit of formatting for the column headers to change the colour of both the background and of the font. I can do this using the properties window at the bottom right hand corner of the screen. I'll set the background colour to, say, cornflower blue, and the font colour to white. And I'll also make the font bold as well. So if I select those cells in the table, I can click on the bold button on the toolbar. Lots of different ways to achieve the same sort of thing in reporting services, but there's a bit of basic formatting just to make things look a little neater. If I finally preview the report again, that doesn't look too bad. Oh, I've encountered my text bug again. Look, it's wiped out the values I entered into those columns. Let's just head back to the design view, and then we should be able to select all of those cells in one go. And then let's just change the font to Arial Narrow first, and then switch it back to Arial again, and that should take care of that. Fantastic. Okay, so there's our basic table up and running. Now we can get into the interesting part and start making this dynamic. In order to make the report dynamic, we need to give the user the opportunity to pass some values into it, and we can achieve that by creating some parameters. We'll start by adding a parameter which allows the user to enter either certificate, country, genre or studio, and to have the table respond by changing the way it's grouped and changing which value it displays in its first column. To create a new parameter, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can either use the parameters grid at the top of the screen, or you can use the parameters folder in the report data window. You can right click on either of those 2 areas and choose to add a parameter, and then simply configure it. Let's give this a name first of all. Let's call this parameter row group field. So that's how I'll reference this parameter in any future code in the report. The prompt is simply what appears next to the parameter when the user is viewing it. So here I'd like to just make this a little simple. Let's just call it group by. I'll leave the data type of the parameter as text for the time being, and then we'll leave all of the other options exactly as they are. I can then click OK, And if I preview the report at that stage, all that we will have achieved is the ability for the user to type in any old bit of text into that text box at the top. It'll have absolutely no impact whatsoever on the report just yet. So what I'd like to do next then is take what the user types in. So let's imagine the user had typed in, let's say, country, for example. I want to be able to take that bit of text and tell the table to group and sort and display the value of the country field in this first column of the table. To make that work, you need to know a little bit about how you can reference fields in a dataset in various parts of a report. Let's go back to the group options for my row group in the group panel at the bottom. If I right click and then choose group properties, we saw earlier on that we grouped that table on the genre field just by selecting it from the drop-down list. An alternative way to do that, if I click the FX button, you'll see the expression builder appears and shows you exactly how the code is written to reference the value of that particular field. Now this is a fairly standard way of doing it in reporting services. You refer to a collection name, in this case fields, followed by an exclamation mark, then the specific item in that collection that you want to refer to, followed by a property of that specific item. An alternative way to achieve the exact same result would be to refer to your fields not with an exclamation mark separating the fields and the field name, but by opening some parentheses immediately after the fields collection, and then writing in the name of the object in a set of double quotes, so treated as a literal piece of text, followed by a closed parenthesis, followed by the property of it. So currently this will make no difference whatsoever to my report. If I click OK, and then click OK again, and then preview that report, it doesn't matter what I type into the parameter just yet. If I view the report at this stage, I'll still see the same result that I saw earlier on, my entire set of results grouped by genre. What we can do then, back in the design view, if I switch back to the row group properties, rather than relying on that field name to be hard-coded, if I click on the FX button next to the group on expression, rather than having that value explicitly typed in, I want to take the bit of text from the row group field parameter and place that inside those parentheses. So what I'm going to do is take away the word genre followed by the double quotes. And then from the parameters list on the left-hand side, making sure my cursor is placed between the two parentheses, I can simply double-click row group field. So if I just change the width of that text box a little so we can see clearly what's going on, when this expression is evaluated, it will group this table with whichever field the name of which has been typed in to the group by box at the top of the report. So let's give this a quick little test. If we click OK at this point, followed by OK again, it won't be a complete solution just yet, but bear with it. If I preview the report at this point, let's just try genre first of all. If I type in genre followed by view report, I should see the exact same thing we've previously seen. Now let's try a different field name. I'm going to go with the field name called certificate. So let's say certificate. I'll be careful to spell that properly, otherwise things will go horribly wrong. There we go, there's certificate. Now you won't see the certificate names just yet because we haven't controlled for that, but you can clearly see that we have far fewer rows in the table because there are far fewer certificates compared to the number of genres. If I change this again, let's type in studio this time and hit enter, I should see far more rows than I saw previously. Of course, still displaying the genre, but with far more rows, this time one row for studio, for each studio. So the next thing we want to do is alter the value displayed in the table, and we can do that in a very, very similar way to the way we change the grouping. If I switch back to the design view, if I right click on the text box which currently displays the genre and then choose expression, you can see once again it's that exact same expression to refer to an explicit field. If I take away the exclamation mark and the genre field name, I can replace that with an open and closed set of parentheses, place the cursor directly inside those parentheses, find the parameters category, and then double click row group field. And then when I click OK and preview the report again, this time we should see, if I type in, let's go with country this time, we haven't tried that one yet. If we type in country, we should see this time that as well as grouping the table by country, we also actually see those country names. Just give that a quick test by changing it to something else. Let's go back to genre again and hit enter. This time we'll see the table back to its original form. It would be nice also if the first column of the table displayed the name that we typed in there. We can achieve that very simply. Back in the design view, if I delete the text that's currently in that text box first of all, a quick and simple way to get the value of the parameter displayed in that text box, I can simply drag the row group field parameter from the parameters folder and position it in that text box, and a little placeholder will appear that will be calculated when the report runs. The last place I wanted to reference our row group field parameter was in the sorting applied to the groups. So once again, I can right click on the row group option in the grouping panel at the bottom of the screen and choose Group Properties. I can then head to the sorting page of that dialog box and then choose to add a sort level. Rather than selecting anything from the drop-down list, I'm just going to jump straight to the FX button to launch the expression builder, and from here I can type in fields, open some parentheses, head to the parameters category and double-click the row group field. I can then close the parentheses, followed by a full stop, and then refer to the value of that field. So that will ensure that no matter which field we picked, the rows will be sorted alphabetically by the appropriate values. If I select OK and OK again, let's just give that a quick little test. If I head to the preview, and let's start with genre, so we know that that one works and we're familiar with those results already. Okay, that looks good, sorted alphabetically by genre, and we can see the genre field name appear at the top of the table. If I change that then to country and hit enter, I should see a different arrangement of the table, sorted alphabetically by country name, and the word country appears at the top. So that all looks like it's working fairly sensibly at this point. Two other ones to test, studio and certificate, but I'm reasonably satisfied that that's working as intended at this point. Now, the obvious problem we have at this stage is that there's nothing to stop the user from typing in whatever they want in this text box, and when they press enter, the entire report falls over. So we'll next restrict what the user can enter into that parameter by creating a drop-down list of available values. This isn't particularly difficult, it's just a little tedious to type in the list you want. But let's head back to the design view, and we want to view the properties of our parameter. We can do this either in the parameters panel at the top or in the parameters folder. And the simplest thing to do is to double click on the parameter. Alternatively, you can right click on it and choose parameter properties. We can then head to the available values page, and we can choose to specify our values and then add in the list of values we want. Now I've got 4 options, so I'm going to click the add button 4 times, followed by clicking into the top left hand cell in that little grid. There are 2 columns to fill in for each value. There's a label and a value. Now label is what's displayed to the user in the drop-down list that will be created, and value is the piece of text or the value or the number or the date or whatever that will actually be used when you reference the parameter. In this case, the label and the value can be the same for all 4 options. So I'm simply going to start by typing in certificate in the top left-hand box. Then I can select all that text by holding down Ctrl and Shift, followed by tapping the left arrow key on the keyboard, Ctrl and C to copy it. Then I can hit the Tab key twice to get to the value column, and then simply paste that in. I can then hit Tab twice more, and then type in country, and then select all the text and copy it. Hit Tab a couple of times and then Ctrl and V to paste it. Tab a couple more times, type in genre, highlight and copy the text, and then paste it. And then one last one, studio, highlight and copy the text, tab a couple of times and Ctrl and V to paste. Okay, so having done that, if I were to click OK at that point, when we preview the report again, this time the user won't have the option to type something in, they simply have to select from the drop-down list which one they want. We can also make it so that the user doesn't have to select the first value. We can set a default value for the parameter so that, for example, it groups by certificate to begin with, and then the user can change that if they want to. To achieve that, back in the design view, you can double click on your parameter either in the grid at the top or in the parameters folder. And then on the default values page of the properties dialog box, we can specify a value. And as long as you specify a value that exists in the list of available values, that will be absolutely fine. So I'm going to go with certificate, followed by clicking OK. And then when we preview the report again, it will immediately be filled in automatically with certificate, and the table will be grouped appropriately. But of course, we still have the option to change which field we group by, and the table will change and update according to our choice. Okay, so that's the easy part done. From this stage, it gets a little bit trickier. The next thing we want to be able to do is create a drop-down list which shows a list of values from the fields we've picked in the first drop-down list. So again, going back to the previous example I showed you, the one that I've deployed, if I have genre selected in the first drop-down, I should end up with a list of all the genres shown in the second drop-down list. Likewise, if I change that to show certificates, then the drop-down list should update to show me only a list of certificates. To begin with, what we'll do is create a drop-down list which shows just a list of genres. So we'll imagine that we were always wanting to show a list of genres in the filter drop-down to begin with. We're certainly not going to sit here and type in the list of genres. There are 24 of them, but that's more than enough that I do not want to have to type all those in. So what we'll do is we'll use a dataset to populate our second parameter. Let's head back to the design view, and we can add our data set first. Let's right click on the movies data source and then choose add data set. I'm going to change the name of the data set so that it's called filter value list. And then we'll simply write in the query to do this. It's such a simple one. I can simply say select genre from genre, and then I'll also order that alphabetically by that same field. So I can say order by genre as well. Having done that, when I click OK, my dataset will be created. When I create a parameter for that, I can populate the parameter with the field from that dataset. So let's create a new parameter. If I right click either the folder or an area in the grid at the top, I can choose to add a parameter. I will call this one filter value. And then the prompt will be something like, I don't know, filter for or filter by. It doesn't really matter too much. The data type will be text, and we'll set the available values, this time not by specifying them, but by getting our values from a query. So I can choose my filter value list dataset, followed by the only field in that one currently, genre and genre, and then click OK. I'll just use the grid to rearrange the positions of those parameters. So I'll drag filter for down so that it sits below group by. And if I preview that report, again, it doesn't matter at this point which group by I have selected. This is always going to show me a list of genres, but just to prove that that does indeed work. Now, selecting an option from here doesn't really do anything, of course. I do need to provide a value for the report to run. But and we've got two other things to do then. We need to be able to affect the list of results returned to the filter value list dataset, so it shows the correct list of values. And then we need to tie in the selected value to filter the table in the report. Let's head back to the design view. Now, there are a number of approaches we could take here to get this filter value list to be populated dynamically. The approach we're going to take, I think, is probably the easiest, and it involves writing an expression for the query property of that dataset. If I right-click the dataset and choose to view its properties, you can see currently that that query is just a bit of plain text, but it also has the option to be calculated using an expression by clicking the FX button. Now, one little thing I need to make sure of here, we're going to be changing the list of values returned by this select statement dynamically, but I do not want the column name to change each time. That makes it incredibly difficult to tie in the parameter to the column name that's returned. So before we start doing the dynamic part, what I'm going to do is give that column an alias. So I'm going to say select genre as filter field or filter column, something like that, but something that is always going to be called filter field. Its name will not change. If I click OK at that point, you'll see that the field list updates here in the dataset window. I'll also need to reset the properties of this parameter to make sure that it refers to that new field name as well. So in the available values, you'll see that it's lost any reference to the genre column because it no longer exists. So I'm going to click filter field and then filter field just to update that. So that should still work normally at this stage. I can still select a list of genres, but that column in that dataset is now called filter field. Now we can start building the expression to produce the correct list of values according to what we've selected from the group by drop-down list. Let's right-click on the filter value list dataset again and choose to view its properties. And then we can click the FX button to launch the expression builder. Now I'll just make this a little larger so we can see what's going on here. Essentially what we need to do is any reference to the genre table or genre column explicitly needs to be replaced by getting its value from the parameter called row group field. This relies on the fact that all of my table names and column names are consistent with the values I'm allowed to select from that row group field drop-down list. So if I looked at the list of table names and column names in the database, if I head back to SQL Server Management Studio briefly, in my list of tables I have a table called certificate and one called country and one called genre and one called studio. Each of those tables are names that exist in my first drop-down list in the report. Equally, the first column, the main column of that table, apart from the ID column, is one that matches the name of the table. So studio and studio, genre, and country, and of course, certificate and certificate. Okay, so this consistency is really important to make this part of the process work. So I'm going to head back to the designer in my Visual Studio application, and what we're going to do is change this from being just a single string of text into one which we concatenate from multiple different bits of text. So we'll convert this into an expression by beginning the whole thing with an equals operator, and then I can start containing little parts of this statement inside a set of double quotes. So the first part of this expression will be always the word select followed by a space. What I then want to do is concatenate not the word genre, but the value of the field I've selected from my row group field parameter drop-down list. So I can replace the word genre, I can take that away, and then double-click the row group field to insert a reference to that parameter's value. I'll then want to concatenate that with some more specific text. So I'm going to leave myself a space after the ampersand. I'm going to take this down to the next line just to make it a little more readable for you guys. I'll open up some more double quotes and then type in a space as filter field from, and then the next bit that will be dynamic is the name of the table we're selecting from. So I'm going to close the double quotes there, followed by a space and an ampersand and another space, and then replace the reference to that column, take genre away from there, and then insert row group field again by double clicking. I can then add another ampersand and another space, and then the final part of the query will be to order by, so I can wrap that section up into some double quotes. Now I could concatenate the row group field value in for the genre here again, but it's slightly easier in this case because we have a simple alias here, filter field. We can reference that column alias in the order by clause. So I can simply say filter field, and then we don't have to worry about making that dynamic. We could also have said actually order by one, so order by the first column in the select list. That would also have worked perfectly well, but I'm going to call mine order by filter field. I think it makes it a little more readable. Okay, so having done that, let's click OK at that point, and then click OK again. And if we preview the report this time, we should find that the filter for list is populated, but this time not with a list of genres as we said previously. This one should now be populated with a list of certificates, and indeed that's what we get. If we select a different value from the group by drop-down list, we should then see a list of different options there. So here's a list of countries, and then genres, we'll get our list of genres back, and then finally studios, and we get a list of studios. Much better than typing them all in. Okay, so that part's working. The next job then is to tie the value we select from the filter to the filters of the table and eventually the chart as well. When we add filters, we have several choices for where we can place them. We can place a filter on an individual item in the report, so this table for example, or we could place it on a group, or we could place it on a data set. Now I think in this example, adding a filter to the dataset is the most appropriate because that dataset will populate multiple items in the report eventually, and we want them all to be filtered in the same way. So rather than having to recreate our filters, we'll add a single filter to the dataset called Film Details, which will affect every object based on it in the report. So let's right-click on the Film Details dataset and choose Dataset Properties. We'll then head to the Filters page and choose to add a filter. And the clue as to what we're going to do here, again, lies in the fact that various parts of each filter can be set using an expression as indicated by this FX button. So the first thing you normally specify in the expression is which column you would like to apply the filter to. Now, of course, this is going to depend on which field we've selected from the Group By drop-down list. So rather than selecting a specific field, we're going to do the same as we did to generate the row group expression earlier, and the sorting expression and the display expression in this text box. Let's click the FX button, and the field I would like to apply my filter to is whatever field has been selected from the row group field parameter. So I can choose fields, parameters, row group field.value, and then .value at the end of that. I can then click OK, and that will dynamically set which column the filter is applied to. I'll start with a simple equals operator to begin with, so we'll start by selecting just a single value and then look at how to expand this to selecting multiple values. And the value that I would like to apply to that filter is whatever I have selected from this filter value parameter. So this one's fairly simple. I can click the FX button and then go to the parameters list and then simply double click filter value. If I then click OK and then click OK again, I can now preview my report. I'll see I get my group by certificate by default, and if I choose a single specific certificate and click View Report, what I will end up with is a table grouped by certificate, but showing only those certificates for 18. And this will work again if I choose a different one. Let's go for genre and then choose, let's go with action as it's the first one there. Let's click View Report, and that will then group the table dynamically by genre and then filter that dataset to show only those genres, or only those films in the action genre. Okay, so that part's working, the dynamic part is working. The next stage is to make this work for allowing us to select multiple values from the Filter For drop-down list. Let's head back to the design view and look at how to do that. Setting a parameter to allow multiple values isn't too difficult. If I go to the parameter properties for the filter value parameter, we can then simply check the box to allow multiple values. So far so simple. If I then click OK, we'll see that if I preview the report, we can indeed select more than one item from this drop-down list, and that works, the selection works at least, but sadly the filter itself doesn't work. So what we need to do next is modify the way the filter works as well. Back in the design view, I'll need to switch back to the Film Details dataset properties. So let's right click on Film Details and choose Dataset Properties. And then from the Filters page, we can change the operator from equals to simply say in. Having done that, if I click OK again, I can then preview the report. And then this time if I choose certificate, which is selected for me automatically, I can then select multiple certificates and then click View Report, and it will eventually, when it finally produces the set of results, show me a separate row for each item I've selected. What would also be quite nice at this stage is, rather than having to select every single value when I choose a different group, it would be nice if that selected automatically all of the possible values from there, essentially selecting all and then showing me the results when I click the View Report button. So we can achieve that same sort of thing by assigning a default value to the Filter For parameter, or the filter value parameter. It's a little more complex than the way we set the default value for the row group field, where we just typed in the word certificate. But if I switch back to the design view, to make this work, we can view the filter value parameter properties. Then we can head to the default values page, and rather than specifying the values, we can choose to get values from a query. So here all we're going to do is populate this parameter with a list of values produced by our filter value list and the filter field column from there. If we click OK and then preview the report again, you ought to see this time that it's immediately populated with our default certificate and then the default list of all of the certificates from the certificate table. And subsequently, when I change the group by field, it then selects all of the genres. If I select genre and when I click View Report, it will automatically include them all. So that's a little bit of convenience for your end users, nothing too difficult. We've already done the hard work in producing the list returned, and we've always got the option to just select the individual genres or certificates or studios or countries that we like. There we go. Okay, so earlier on in the video, I deliberately excluded the director table from my main film details dataset. Although in the example I showed you that was already deployed, we do have the option to select director from the drop-down list and indeed see a list of director names appear in the filter drop-down list. The reason I excluded it at the early stage was because there's a little inconsistency in the way the table and the columns are named in the director table. If I look back at my SQL Server database and just collapse these other tables I was showing you earlier, let's have a look at the director table. Its name is director, but the columns in there aren't called things like director name. We have a calculated column, a computed column called full name, which consists of the first name and the family name. So we couldn't use that same basic trick we showed you with all of the other tables. What I'd like to do then is be able to select from my drop-down list. I'd like to see the word director appear, but for it to store the value full name, which is the actual name of that field. So a little bit more effort required to make this one work. Let's head back to Visual Studio and head back to the design view. And the first thing we'll do is add in the appropriate value to be selected from the row group field parameter. Let's view its properties and then head to the available values page and then click add to add a new item. Now label is what's displayed to the user when they use the report, and I want them to be able to see the word director in the drop-down list. So let's type in director for the label. What I then want is for them to store the name full name, which is the actual name of the column in that table. I'd also like this to appear alphabetically in this list, so I'm going to select the director value and then use the up arrow to position it just below country and before genre. If I then click OK, that will allow me to select that item from the drop-down list when I run the report. Next, we need to change the way the query works for the filter value list dataset. Currently, if I selected director from the row group field drop-down list, it would set the query for filter value list to say select full name from full name. And that's not right. We needed to say select full name from director. So let's edit the properties of our filter value list dataset and then click the FX button next to the query box. And in the part where we're reading the value of the row group field parameter after the from clause, we want to change that to use the label instead. If we click OK, and then OK again, one other place where I'd like to refer to the label of my drop-down list parameter rather than its value is in the header cell of the first column of the table. I added in the row group field placeholder just by clicking and dragging earlier on, and this will implicitly use the value of that parameter. So if I were to choose director from that drop-down list, the column header would say full name, which isn't particularly useful for the end user. So let's right-click into that text box and choose expression, and then once again change the word value to the word label instead. Then we can click OK, and then there's one more change we need to make. If we want to be able to group by and filter for directors' full names, then we'll need to include the appropriate field in the film details dataset as well. So let's right-click film details and we can just jump straight to the query editor here by clicking the query option rather than dataset properties. We can then choose to add in another table, and then we can choose the director table. We can then close down the add table window and choose to include the full name field from the director table. We should then be able to click OK, and then we should be able to simply test this query now or test this entire system by clicking preview. And then if we were to, once the report has finished loading, if we finally select the director field from the drop-down list, we ought to see that it's filtered automatically for all of the directors from the directors dataset. I can, let's see, uncheck a few of those and then just check a couple, 2 or 3 or 4, and then click the View Report button to filter that dataset for just the selected directors. And hopefully that's exactly what we'll end up with. So there we go, the system's working pretty well at this point. Now, there is one other fairly major problem I'd like to try to solve at this point, and it's to do with the country table in our result set. If I were to select the country field from my group by clause, I get a list of essentially every country in the world, or at least in the list of country names that I copied and pasted from wherever I copied it from some years ago. Now, the issue with this, of course, is there are many countries of the world, and not every film in my database has been made in one of those countries. So there are many items in here I could select that won't return any results at all. So what I would like to do ideally is change the list of options I get in my filter for drop-down list to only those eligible countries or eligible values. There are also some directors in the direct table which have not directed any films, so I'd like to make sure that the filter for list only contains options that will return some results. This isn't hugely difficult, it's just a little bit fiddly. It involves changing the query for the filter value list dataset to essentially join the main table to the film table to include only those results that have been used in the film table. So the query itself isn't massively complicated, it just involves a lot of concatenation and referring to the values of parameters to make it work properly. So I'm just going to head back to the design view of the report, and it might make sense just to quickly demonstrate how this works in SQL Server Management Studio first. If I create a brand new query in here, and I can write out a basic query that explains what we're going to do in our dataset in the report project. If we imagine what happens if we selected country from our row group field parameter, the query that's generated for populating the filter value list dataset essentially looks like select country, I can spell that correctly, I'll try that again, as filter field, from country, and then an order by filter field. So if I were to execute that one by either pressing F5 or clicking the execute button, I end up with a list of every single country from the country table. I'll press Ctrl R just to hide that results panel for the moment. In order to show only those countries that have been allocated to a film in the film table, I'll need to join the film table to the country table. This works best if I have an alias for each table. It avoids having to write the table names in multiple times. So I'm going to assign an alias to the country table, country as C. In fact, beg your pardon, country as T. And then I'm going to write an inner join. So on the next line I'll say inner join, or just join is sufficient. Film as F. And then I need to specify which columns these tables are joined on. So I can say on T dot country ID equals F dot country ID. So having done that, if I were to execute that query at this point, I'll end up with one country name for every single film in the film table that has a country assigned to it. What I want to do, of course, is just show each country name once and once only. So if I add the distinct keyword to the select list, if I say select distinct country as filter field, when I execute that, I'll end up with one single country name for each country that has been assigned to a film in the film table. Now this same thing is true regardless of which table I'm joining in. Imagine I'd selected the genre field, or the genre table from my first row group field drop-down list. If I highlight all this text here and press Ctrl H for find replace, I could type in country and then replace with genre, and if I hit the replace all button, I'll see I get a list of unique genres that have been allocated to films in the film table, so one row for each genre. So essentially what we need to do is construct a statement like this, which involves concatenating the value, or indeed sometimes the label of our parameter, multiple times in the query or in the expression. So let's head back to the project in Visual Studio. Let's head back to our filter value list dataset. I'm going to right click on it and choose dataset properties. And then I'm going to click the FX button and look at how we can modify this expression to generate the query I've just shown you. So if we start at the beginning, I guess the first thing we can do is add in the distinct keyword to make sure we only get one single country name or genre name or certificate name, etc. Then we'll get the name of the field according to the value of the row group field parameter, which is exactly what we want. We'll give it an alias as filter field from, and then we've got the name of the table, this time using the label so that to ensure that we get the director table rather than the full name table. This is where things get a little more complex then. we need to then specify that we've added an alias to that table. So we'll need to concatenate some extra text in here. If I give myself an extra line, I want to say as T. I'm using T just because it's generically for table, and as we're going to be adding in a different table each time according to what we've selected in our parameter, T is the nice generic name to use. We then need to say that we've joined that with either a join or an inner join, that the two are equivalent in TSQL, so I'll go with inner join. And then I'll always want to join this to the film table, and I'll always give that an alias as F. We can then say which columns these tables are joined on, so I can say on, and then I can say T dot, and then close double quotes, and then have an ampersand. So this is the point at which I want to refer to the column in the table, in the main table, so country table or genre table or certificate table, which contains the ID of that table. So looking back at my query, previously we've had t.genre ID. So I need to include the name of the table I've selected in between the t dot and the letters ID. So here I'm going to concatenate the parameters row group field dot label. That's to make sure that I get director ID and not full name ID. So I'll copy and paste that. And then I'm going to use another ampersand followed by a space and then come down to the next line and in some double quotes, concatenate ID to the end of that column name. And then I want to make that equal to F dot. And then again, I need to concatenate the name of the table I've selected. So I'm going to concatenate and paste in again parameters row group field dot label. Finally, I need to make sure that I've added the letters ID to the end of that. So it's director ID and country ID and genre ID. And I think the most appropriate place to do that is just before the order by clause. It all looks a little bit messy when you read it like this, but you just have to trust that when it's all concatenated together into a single continuous statement, it looks like a valid SQL statement like this, and it will actually run. So I trust myself a reasonable amount. I'm pretty happy that that looks okay. I'm going to click OK at that point and then click OK again. And let's give this a quick test. If I preview the report, if things don't go wrong immediately, that's a good sign. So I'm still getting my list of certificates, it appears. So I'm selecting all the valid allocated certificates from the certificate table. Let's just try selecting genre, for example, and making sure that that updates to show me the list of genres. That looks pretty good. The acid test then is if I select country, I get just a list of country names that have been allocated to films in the film table. And there they are. So that makes it a lot easier to compare specific countries. Let's just pick a few of these at random. It doesn't really matter what we pick. When we view the report, hopefully all the filters will work. And there we are. So there's pretty much the core part of the system working pretty nicely at that point. At this point, the rest of the report is fairly trivial. Adding a chart to sit alongside the table doesn't take too much effort, and it's all based on the same principles we've looked at to build the table and assign the grouping to that. But as I showed you that in the start of the video, I might as well explain how that's created as well. Feel free to switch off at this stage though if you're not interested in building charts, because the other techniques we're going to include here are just the same as the ones we've used to build the table. So back in the design view, I'm going to right click somewhere next door to my table and choose to insert a chart. I'll pick a basic clustered column chart, which is the default anyway, and click OK. And then I can start by adding in some basic expressions to build up the various elements of the chart. If I click inside the chart to expose the chart data panel, I've already got a group option here, the details item for the category groups, much like we had for our table earlier on. And just as I did with my table earlier on, I'm going to right click on that details item and choose category group properties. And then I'm going to add a group expression to that, which groups on whichever field name I've selected from the row group field parameter. So just as we did earlier, if I click the FX button, I can choose to group on fields, open some parentheses, head to the parameters list and double click row group field, close the parentheses and say dot value. At this point, if I click OK and then I'll add to the sorting page as well. I want to sort by the same expression. In fact, I should have just copied and pasted that, but never mind. Let's head to the sorting page and click Add, and then click FX. And then again, no harm in having a bit of practice, I suppose. Fields, open parentheses, parameters, row group field, close the parentheses, dot value. I can then click OK again, and OK again, and there's our grouping set up. I'll then want some values to display inside the chart. So again, making sure I can see the chart data panel, I can add a variety of values here. I want to see the same things as I saw in my table. So I want to start with a count of film ID. I'll add in from my movies dataset, my movies data source and the film details dataset, the film ID field. That'll give me a sum of film ID, just as it did in the table. But I can change that by clicking the drop-down arrow, choosing aggregate, and then choosing count. I can then add another field, and this time I'll go with the runtime minutes. And again, I can change the sum to an average, followed by finally adding in the Oscar wins field, and that will automatically give me a sum, and that's the one that I want. Let's just increase the size of the chart a little bit to make it vaguely readable. I should want to make it quite tall actually, so we can see what's going on height-wise. Then I'll get rid of the chart title as well. I'm just going to select the chart title and delete that entirely to give myself a bit more space. At this point, you might consider hiding the parameters panel because it can get in the way. So if you right-click somewhere off the edge of the report and choose View and then untick parameters, it gives you a little more space in designing the report itself, which can be helpful. If I preview the report then at that point, all the filtering is automatically done. So if I choose certificate, which is the default, and I choose every single certificate, which again is the default, what we should see is as well as the table showing a separate row for each certificate, the chart also shows a separate sort of group of columns for each certificate in that list as well. A few bits of things we can do to tidy up. We can change what's displayed in the legend so that it shows not just the column name, film ID and runtime minutes, but it shows the count of films and average runtime, etc. If I switch back to the design view, we can right-click on one of the columns in the chart. So I want to make sure I change the series properties. So if I right-click on the pale blue bar first, or the aqua bar, and choose series properties, if I head to the legend page on the dialog box, I can change the custom legend text. So that will be count of films, and then hit OK. And similarly for each of the other series, if I click on the black bars and then right click and choose series properties. Oh, by the way, if you wanted to change the color of a set of bars, you can head to the fill tab and choose a different color. I'm just going to continue by changing the legend names. I'm happy with the default colors. So this one was AVG runtime. And then finally for the red bars, I'll right click on those and choose series properties and call that on the legend page total Oscars. Okay, so having done that, if I preview the report again, we ought to end up with a slightly better set of names in the legend. Eventually. There we go, count of films, average runtime, total Oscars. We can also, although I didn't demonstrate it earlier, we can also change the group by field and the range of values we select, and those will all be displayed appropriately in the chart as well. So it takes a little bit more waiting for this to happen, but it will get there eventually. And there we are. One small downside to having lots of values in a chart is that by default, it doesn't display a label for every single category. We can solve that as well actually if we switch back to the design view and scroll to the bottom of the chart. I can just drag the scroll bar downwards. If we can highlight the labels at the bottom, you can then right click on there and choose horizontal axis properties. In the first page of the dialog, axis options, you can find the interval property and simply set that to the number 1. That will mean that there will be one label displayed for every one category in the chart. So doing that, if I were to click OK, if we can bear waiting for it one more time, we can display the chart. And then when it has loaded, we can simply change the option in the group by drop-down list. Let's go for genre again, just to prove that it has worked for genre, and that should hopefully reassure you that it will work for all of the other categories as well. And there we go. So there is, I think, our full dynamically grouped and dynamically filtered table and chart report. Okay, so there we go. I hope you found some of the techniques we've used in this video helpful, maybe give you a few ideas about how dynamic a report can actually be in reporting services. I'd just like to thank Chris and Melanie and Eric and Dylan for the question in the first place, and for travelling all the way from Michigan to sunny Manchester to pay us a visit and sit on one of our SQL training courses. Hopefully that's answered your question, guys. It wasn't the only way to do it. I know, Eric, you had a suggestion to use temp tables and some dynamic SQL. I tested that and it works perfectly well. It just seemed that this was a slightly cleaner solution, keeping everything within expressions in reporting services. But anyway, there we go. There's the full example created. Thanks for watching that one. See you next time.